I recently watched the Spider-Man cartoon from the 90s, and I was actually really glad I did. Yeah, there are better looking cartoons out there, and it was a bit heavy on the flashbacks for my taste, but this is one of the most genuinely engaging adaptations of Marvel Comics I've seen, and gives a well-rounded adult Peter Parker that I've really only gotten from the PS4 Insomniac games. The overarching storylines, grounded, enjoyable characters, and a phenomenal cast more than make up for the occasional lull in the pacing. Interestingly, while watching the show, on top of recognizing how good it generally was, I also noticed that the show was progressive. Like, surprisingly so. This show ran for 5 seasons, all of which were in the 90s, so it's not like I was expecting it to be as offensive as the shows from the 60s were, but I was pleasantly shocked at just how far out of its way the show went to examine justice beyond the context of good guys punching bad guys. I'm not just referring to diversity of characters either, although the show does a good job at that as well, with diversity on the screen and behind the scenes. But no, diversity doesn't automatically mean a story is progressive. A diverse cast can still be used to reinforce stereotypes or promote existing power structures. Where this show separates itself is how there are actual characters and storylines that address social injustice. Take, for example, the episode The Rocket Racer, which features Robert Farrell, a working-class black teenager that has to choose between exploring his scientific pursuits or working in his mother's store to help her save money to afford the medication she needs. When he just happens to be in the vicinity of Spider-Man's battle with the criminal Big Wheel, and he stumbles upon some money that's been dropped by the villain, the police arrest him, despite him obviously having nothing to do with the robbery. His mother's friend, Felicia Hardy, has to post bail. However, the police are nowhere to be found when 3 men vandalize and extort Mrs. Farrell's store. Knowing no matter what he does, the police will view him as a thief, Robert uses his scientific know-how to create a rocket board to potentially help him commit crimes, but on the night he plans to do so, he still can't go through with it. Still, again, despite not stealing anything, he gets the attention of the police and, this time, Spider-Man, who actually helped teach Robert a bit about science. When he asks him why he stole, which, again, he didn't actually, he responds with this.
It's not an easy thing down here. I bet when you take off that mask and go home, you don't come to this neighborhood. See, I didn't steal anything, but everyone thinks I did. So what's the point of playing by the rules, man? Tell me that, Spider Guy.
Which, he has a great point. Peter's difficulties are all due to the fact that he's Spider-Man. He doesn't face racial profiling, he doesn't live in a rough neighborhood, he doesn't need to choose between science and supporting his loved ones. The episode never directly says that Robert is discriminated against because of his race, but it's pretty obvious that he is. The episode also gives Robert a chance to confront the extortioners and Big Wheel as Rocket Racer, and he's able to become a hero. The episode is bittersweet as he's able to come out of the situation positively, but the systems that forced him into it are still in place, obviously. There is also the episode where a pre-mobster Tombstone, just a child at the time, goes to prison simply for stealing a thing of ice cream, setting him on his path of crime. Or the episode where Robbie, a well-known, upstanding member of the community, is framed for a crime, and his sentencing is fast-tracked and his pleas ignored. Even within the criminal world, we see the double standards, as when Hobie Brown, a black man, saves Richard Fisk's life, his father, Kingpin, pretends to want to reward him, but instead converts him into an unwilling soldier, whereas individuals like the Insidious Six are rewarded for helping Kingpin with no strings attached. And I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up Omar Mosley. In the comics, the World War II hero Black Marvel was Dan Lyons, a white savior character that is chosen as the champion of the Blackfeet after he proves he's better at doing stereotypically Native American things like running, swimming, archery, and bear wrestling. Rather than just adapt that, the show changed things drastically. Abandoning the Blackfeet champion angle, the show re-envisions Black Marvel and a couple other Golden Age Marvel heroes as test subjects following the formula that created Captain America. According to the government, Black Marvel is Dan Lyons, wealthy white socialite. In reality, though Lyons volunteered, his father didn't want an experimental test run on his son, but he had no qualms conducting it on Omar Mosley, his black driver. Mosley saw the opportunity to become more than an employee, so he took it. However, given public perception and the segregation of the U.S. military, Omar couldn't be recognized as a war hero. Still, he named himself Black Marvel as a reference to this erasure of his identity. The use of black people as medical test subjects is something that has happened worldwide, and black people in history regularly have their contributions minimized or misattributed to white people. And for a children's cartoon to not only reference that, but explore that, that's something you don't see too often. And those are just a few things. The show has commentary on proper gun safety, abusive relationships, ageism, ableism, sexism in the workplace, classism, and even more commentary about racism that I didn't touch. Now, why was this show so progressive? Like, more so than the vast majority of anything put out by Marvel Studios. Part of the credit goes to the creative team, and especially showrunner John Semper Jr., who has a long, successful career where he has not shied away from discussing racism, ableism, and classism. Not really surprised there that the Spider-Man show with a black showrunner talks more about anti-blackness than the other ones that don't have a black showrunner. The time in which the show was made, I'm sure, also contributed to why the producers allowed messages condemning racial profiling by police, commentary showcasing excessive wealth and owning buildings as stepping stones to being a bad person, and warnings about leaving guns unsecured around children. But no matter why, I find it interesting that Spider-Man the Animated Series, despite being incredibly successful, was relatively alone. Sure, there have been other superhero shows to discuss racism, but they're usually marketed exclusively towards adults and have black leads. By using Marvel's most famous character as the starting point, Semper reached a ton of individuals that he otherwise might not have. Now, please don't take this to mean that I think shows like Black Lightning shouldn't talk about racism, or that black creators need to work with white characters to tell stories. Not at all. What I'm saying is that when the only TV shows of the MCU that talk about anti-black racism are the shows with black leads, when the only part of the Arrowverse that talks about anti-black racism is with a black lead, when racism is seen as a topic that only shows up in a superhero media, when the titular character can be on the receiving end of it, it sends a message, intentional or not, that racism is something that the audiences of the rest of the shows and movies don't necessarily need to learn about, or rather, unlearn. Racial profiling by police is something Peter Parker couldn't experience, and it's something that the white fans of the show couldn't either. That doesn't mean it's not important to educate and teach empathy to young viewers, to show the world as it is and illustrate that you should use your privilege to combat the systemic prejudices put in place, even though they might benefit you. Racism isn't a theme that should only appear in TV shows with leads of color, just like sexism isn't a theme that would only appear in TV shows with leads that are women. Now, I'm not saying that every white showrunner out there should jot down their own thoughts on racism, throw a script at some actors, and call it a day. Far from it. But there should be a diverse team of writers, regardless of who the lead of a show is, since we live in a diverse world. And if the show intends to teach children valuable lessons, or intends to portray the world with any amount of realism, it does a disservice to pretend the experiences of some of your writers and some of your audiences don't exist. Let me be clear, I'm not saying every story needs to be about race. Rather, if the only stories about race are the ones marketed to people of color, the audience that most needs to learn the lesson is going to be the least likely to receive it. Spider-Man the Animated Series did a rather impressive thing in using its admittedly simple premise as a way to talk about very serious subjects. It might have been the only one of its kind, but I think it gave an impressive example of what you can do with an already established character and use that universe to tell a good story while at the same time making an impact on your viewers.